This program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk, the Bronx's flagship television talk show. The phones are open tonight, so please join the dialogue by calling in at 718-960-7241. You can also email comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Well, today, November 22nd, should ring familiar. It's the 47th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So we thought we'd do a different sort of show tonight to commemorate that historic event and talk about the nation's 35th president and his connection to the Bronx. Yes, the Bronx. And while we're on the subject, we thought it also would be a good opportunity to talk about presidents and the Bronx in general, as well as evaluate the legacy of JFK, especially in relation to the current president, who is also one of the most youthful in history, and as Kennedy was, the first of his ethnicity to hold the nation's highest office. Excuse me, to help us on our presidential journey tonight, two esteemed historians. First, the Bronx Borough historian, always a pleasure to have with us, Professor Lloyd Alton. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
And also an expert in American foreign relations, 20th century American history, and American political and diplomatic history from Lehman College, Professor Dwayne Tannenbaum. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Gary.
Professor Alton, let's start with you. JFK assassinated on this day 47 years ago. Was there anything particular in the Bronx on that day that the Bronx did to commemorate it, or was the Bronx simply like thousands of other American communities?
Well, I remember that day clearly, as most people who lived through that do. And the day itself that happened in 1963 was basically a shock. You know, it started out as an ordinary day. At the time, I was teaching as a substitute teacher in DeWitt Clinton High School, and I was in the GO office, which is the student organization, and just talking around. It was between classes, and suddenly Walter Degnan, who was then the principal of DeWitt Clinton High School, gets on the public address system and says that John F. Kennedy had been shot, and just shot, and this immediately caused a shock for everybody who was there. And then about a half hour later, he got on and said, that he's gone. And that was basically how he said it. He was gone. There were two announcements. And it was very close to the end of the school day. So almost immediately after, the corridors were filled with students and with teachers. And they were walking around in a complete state of shock. Staring out in midair. And one student came over to me because he knew that I taught history. He said, how could this have happened? We read about it in the history books, so long ago, but today, right. Basically everybody, went home as best they could, under the circumstances. And I began to first realize the magnitude of the thing when I got out of the subway and was walking home. At that time, I was living on the Grand Concourse on 158th Street, which is diagonally across from the county building. And as I passed by the county building, I saw the flags there at half staff. And then
things had moved kind of quickly.
And then it hit. Mm-hmm. And of course, I got home and just basically sat down in front of the television set as millions of other people did.
Sure. one of the legacies, or one of the really interesting side notes, which connects the Bronx to JFK, is that he lived here. I think
That's right.
many people, it's one of the things that I thought of when we established tonight's show, JFK, the Bronx, and the presidency. So let's talk a little bit about JFK in the Bronx. Where did he live? When did he live in the Bronx?
Okay.
And what else can you tell us about him?
Well, it was in the late 1920s when his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, purchased a rather large house, not quite a mansion, but a rather large house on West 252nd Street and Independence Avenue.
Okay, and history will show us it was 5040 Independence Avenue.
And it was directly across from the northern part of the property that's Wave Hill. And at that time, Joseph P. Kennedy was the head of 20th Century Fox, and obviously a wealthy man. And all his children, except Ted, who hadn't been born yet, was there with him. John F. Kennedy was enrolled in the Riverdale Country School, which is a private school in Riverdale, and he was educated there. And even after they moved out of that building, they still kept John F. Kennedy in there until he could graduate.
Graduate from, let's say, sixth grade at the time?
Yes, and the interesting thing is that even today, the Riverdale Country School has his graduation photograph.
It's interesting because history, of course, notes the Kennedys as being from Massachusetts, and somehow the Bronx didn't get, I think it's due credit. I mean, that is where he got his original schooling.
Well, Kennedy actually mentioned that in his 1960 campaign, because he actually campaigned in the Bronx. He came up the Grand Concourse to a huge rally on Fordham Road, right in front of the Wagner Building, the office building that's on the southeast corner. A huge crowd over there. And the first words out of his mouth were, I'm from the Bronx.
Really?
Albeit Riverdale, but it is the Bronx.
And did he say that?
He actually said that.
One of the other things that I uncovered, which I guess is also a matter of history, is that apparently he was caught cheating at the Riverdale Country School. Is that he wasn't a great student, he wasn't a scholar, but he actually was caught looking at somebody's paper in this.
Well, actually, most presidents have not been great scholars. So
I don't think we want to go there today. We're commemorating and honoring our presidents. Professor Tannenbaum, let's bring you into the conversation. JFK's legacy, he's I guess, in death was, thought to be maybe even a greater president than he was, although I think many accomplishments during his presidency. Where do you put him in terms of evaluating the legacy of John Fitzgerald Kennedy?
Historians have always rated John F. Kennedy much lower than the general public does. The general public sees Kennedy as the martyred president, this young, vigorous, active leader with a beautiful wife, the young children, and that's what they remember. As Lloyd said, we all remember where we were when we heard the news that day, and that's the image of Kennedy that's frozen in the mind, along with the fact that, at least according to popular legend, he looked the Soviets in the eye and they blinked first in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But historians have a much more rounded picture of Kennedy. Historians appreciate the fact that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy made a couple of secret promises that the U.S. would not invade Cuba and that the U.S. would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And that was why the Soviets backed down, not because Kennedy forced them to do it. Because it was
this, at least the way it's pictured all the way into movies, that it was this dramatic moment and he held his ground and all those kinds of things.
Exactly. Let me read a couple of quotes from the New York Times in 1962, talking about Kennedy at that stage of his presidency. Vacillation has been the outstanding characteristic of his approach to the most critical of all domestic issues. No administration has ever accomplished so little with so many potential votes. There were 64 Democratic senators at that time and a huge Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. But all of Kennedy's major initiatives, medical care for the aged, a farm bill, creating a cabinet-level urban affairs department, all of those were stalled in Congress. During the campaign of
So he couldn't even convince the leaders of his own party to pass legislation that he deemed important.
Yes, and that's largely because a significant number of those Democrats were Southern Democrats. They were conservative Democrats. And Congress really, from about 1938 until 1964, was controlled by a conservative coalition, Republicans joining with these conservative Southern Democrats. They had given Harry Truman fits when Truman had tried to get government health insurance passed back in the late 40s and early 50s, and they continued to bedevil Kennedy. But Kennedy was also much more cautious than he is remembered today. During the campaign of 1960...
You're so correct, because he's seen as this pioneer and this, I don't want to use too strong a word and say revolutionary, but this innovator, and you're saying that maybe he wasn't.
And not just that, but dynamic and forceful. During the campaign of 1960, he criticized Eisenhower and Nixon, the Republicans, claiming that segregation in housing could be ended with the stroke of a pen by the president signing an executive order. 1961 and 1962 came and went, and even though many African Americans sent Kennedy pens, he never signed that executive order. It was really only in 1962 when James Meredith tried to become the first black man attending the University of Mississippi and had a federal court order ordering him admitted, that Kennedy really acted strongly, vigorously in the field of civil rights.
Of course,
a field he's remembered for so much today.
With his brother as the lead soldier in that effort.
Right. And it's also African Americans in the streets in Birmingham in 1963 that finally lead Kennedy to introduce his civil rights bill.
It may be a fair or unfair question. It's certainly been asked through history. Had he lived, do you think he would have had a chance to win over some of those critics through history? Or is it not fair to speculate at this point?
It's always impossible to say with any certainty what might have happened, what would have happened. But certainly in 1963, you do see Kennedy moving strongly in the area of civil rights. You do see Kennedy signing the nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. You do see Kennedy pressing for a tax cut to stimulate the economy. The question is whether Kennedy would have been able to get things like the Civil Rights Bill through Congress.
Well, you know, when you were talking about the Southern Democrats, of course, right away you think of LBJ, and maybe it was more possible to get the Civil Rights Act through because of LBJ as, of course, a Southern Democrat.
It's not so much that LBJ was a Southern Democrat. It's more that having been Senate Majority Leader for 6 years, he knew where all the bodies were buried on Capitol Hill, and he had ways to persuade Southern Democrats like Richard Russell of Georgia, not so much to support the bill, the Civil Rights Bill, but not to filibuster it for too long, to let it reach the floor where it always had enough support if it could only reach the floor.
Hang in there, Professor Alton. We're going to get back to you and about the Bronx, but we're all learning a lot from Professor Tannenbaum here. You know, the things you say about Kennedy suggest, of course, the current president. I had mentioned at the top of the show, of course, Kennedy, the first Catholic, and Barack Obama, the first black president. And historians have begun to draw parallels and say, well, his first 2 years and the first 2 or 3 years, ultimately, of course, are the only years we had for Kennedy. Is there a comparison that's worth making between Barack Obama and John Fitzgerald Kennedy? And does it give us a clue into how Obama's presidency is going?
I do think that there are a lot of similarities. The couple that you raised, obviously, in terms of being a member of a very distinct ethnic group. There's also having a great deal of difficulty getting your priorities through Congress. Kennedy had 64 senators. Obama had 64 the first year. They also were both involved in major wars overseas. It's under Kennedy that the United States significantly escalated its involvement in Vietnam, and it started to become the quagmire which the United States simply could not get out of. You know, you talk about the government in Iraq today being unable to form a new government.
Or certainly Obama's interest and emphasis on Afghanistan.
Right, and the government in Afghanistan, where one day Karzai wants our help, the next day he's saying, no, we want the Americans out. It was very similar to what Kennedy experienced with President Diem. And then finally in 1963, in November, just 3 weeks before Kennedy's own death, the Kennedy administration basically gives the South Vietnamese generals the approval to go ahead with a coup and overthrow Diem, because Diem is seen as interfering in the war against communism. And, all these what-if questions about Kennedy, it's under Kennedy that the war in Vietnam became front-page news in a way that it had not been under Eisenhower. Kennedy inherited a situation where there were 700 U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. By the end of Kennedy's administration, there were 15,000 U.S. troops, special forces, Green Berets there.
Mm-hmm. And so let's go back and talk about the current president. His challenge, of course, which is ironic, and you talked about Kennedy having a Democratic Congress. Obviously, this is what Obama had in the first part of his term, but it certainly doesn't appear he has one now. Where's the parallel and the difficulties? And is there a way now to start predicting how history will look at Obama, or is it too early? And certainly we hope he lives in a lot longer than Kennedy did.
Well, let me just quote one other thing. This is from the New York Times in October of 1962, reporting on a speech that Kennedy had given during the beginning of the congressional campaign. In Cincinnati on Friday, Kennedy declared about the Republicans, they have made the word no a political program. That's all they know how to say. No matter what I propose, their answer is no.
That is amazing, because this is almost as if Barack Obama lifted that statement out.
As the Republicans see the issue, the question is whether the nation wants to progress further toward a welfare state under a Democratic administration whose hallmark is fiscal irresponsibility. The Republican congressional leaders contend that they have reflected public opinion accurately, and that what the president calls their obstructionism is actually prudent restraint of a spendthrift regime.
Wow.
I mean, if I hadn't told you the date, you would think that
I would
was
say, well,
today's
this is
newspaper.
analysis, you pulled it out of the Times this afternoon.
Exactly. So the parallels are very strong. Where the parallels diverge was with the midterm elections. As we all know, President Obama and the Democrats suffered huge losses in the midterm elections. I think the latest count is 50, or actually I think it's up to 60 seats in the House of Representatives,
I thought. Okay.
and 6 seats in the U.S. Senate. Much to everyone's amazement, in the midterm elections of 1962, the Democrats, who already had 64 Senate seats, actually picked up 4 more to increase their majority in the Senate. They lost about 4 or 5 seats in the House of Representatives. That was the best showing for a party in power in the off-year election since Franklin Roosevelt in 1934.
We're gonna move back to the notion of the Bronx, but to me it's because of 2 things. One is ability to control a much larger and more effective media that exists right now, which is what the Republicans were able to do, and the second part of it is that Kennedy's appeal, his personal appeal, was just that much stronger, I think. And
no, I don't mean to contradict you.
Hey, I've been wrong before.
But what it really was is that the Cuban Missile Crisis came in October of 1962. So Kennedy, in the last months of October, just before the election, appears, as we said earlier, as the strong, decisive leader standing up to the Russians and forcing them to back down. What better way for your party to go into an election? It's
the old story: create a war, and you can look a little better. Let's talk. Let's go back and talk about presidents in the Bronx. Kennedy lived in the Bronx. Any other presidents lived in the Bronx?
Well, there's one president that lived in the Bronx, at least temporarily, and that was John Adams. John Adams, of course, is also connected with Massachusetts, but in 1797 he was president of the United States, and he was on his way from Massachusetts to Philadelphia, which was then the temporary capital, going down the brand new Boston Post Road.
Wow.
And
newly
created Boston Post Road. And he got word that a yellow fever epidemic had broken out in Philadelphia. And having a severe case of the smarts, John Adams says, I'm not going there. But right on the brand new Boston Road was the farmhouse that belonged to his daughter and son-in-law, where Boston Road and Connor Street are today, which is just across the highway from the northernmost part of Co-op City. And so he stopped on the way there, and he stayed there in that house governing the United States as president from that house.
It's such a historical spot. Is there any commemoration of that at this point?
No. As a matter of fact,
I don't know.
No. Years ago, I tried to preserve the house, which was still standing, but the guy who owned it, knew that it was an historic house and didn't want to destroy it, but he never did anything to keep it in repair, and it fell apart.
We know that George Washington essentially slept everywhere.
Yes,
but
that's why he's the father of our country.
Didn't he? You said that that Adams was the only one who lived in the Bronx, other than Kennedy, of course. Washington didn't sleep at the Van Cortlandt house.
Oh, he slept at the Van Cortlandt house, but I would hardly call that living.
I see. It was.
It was like staying at the inn. But he was in the Bronx for many months at various times during the American Revolution, and he slept in the Van Cortlandt house 3 times.
One of the most significant influences or impacts a president had was with the Bronx Zoo.
Yes.
I'll lead you the way. We have the Bronx Zoo because of
Teddy Roosevelt.
Give us a little background.
Well, what happened was that Teddy Roosevelt, this is before he was president, was the head of a hunting club made up of wealthy New Yorkers called the Boone and Crockett Club, named after Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. And one of the members had gone out west to shoot the big game and discovered that there was hardly any of the big game around anymore. Wrote a letter to Teddy Roosevelt saying, we ought to do something to preserve the game because otherwise we can't go hunting anymore. And so it was
purely selfish reasons.
Right. But Teddy Roosevelt then formed a committee of the club to explore the idea of establishing a zoo in New York City. And that committee eventually became the New York Zoological Society, which is now the Wildlife Conservation Society.
Right.
And they are the ones who created the Bronx Zoo. And after he was president of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt actually visited the Bronx Zoo, and the Bronx Zoo has a photograph of Teddy Roosevelt on the steps of the administration building.
Wow, right in the same building.
Right.
Professor Tannenbaum, let's talk about Carter and Reagan. You, of course, you wrote a book on Reagan. Not a book?
I wrote an essay.
An essay, okay. Each were in the South Bronx on Charlotte Street. Which was the more significant? Of course, the big headlines. There was a Jimmy Carter said to the Bronx, "Drop dead."
No, that was Gerald Ford to
Gerald
New York
Ford
City.
to New York
and it was
City.
to New York City in the fiscal crisis.
But each of them, sorry, I've got all my historical references mixed up. But Carter and Reagan were each on Charlotte Street. Which was the more significant visit?
Well, Carter basically came during the campaign and with a promise to rebuild the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That was when the Bronx was really at its depths. The Bronx is burning and everything. And I do think that some of the rebirth begins under Carter. The Reagan administration did very little in terms of urban policy or urban renewal. So certainly, Carter's visit had much more significance.
Much more impact.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan came and campaigned at Charlotte Street, he was met with a small hostile crowd, and they were heckling him, and he had an outburst. He says, I can't help you unless I'm elected president. So he was elected president and didn't help him.
And then simply cut back on a lot of the initiatives that might have
exactly. And thus put the whole burden on the city and the state to try and repair the whole Charlotte Street thing. I would also say, as far as Jimmy Carter's visit, I think that it had the greater impact only because the image of the Bronx up until that time was of a healthy middle-class area, that the entire Bronx was healthy and middle-class. And that was the national image and the international image. And suddenly, there is Jimmy Carter walking the plains of Charlotte Street, rubble all around. And in the background, you could see burnt-out buildings that have boarded up windows. And people were actually shocked at seeing this. And that is, unfortunately, imprinted the bad image of the Bronx on the mind of the people even today.
Ironically, of course, what Jimmy Carter ultimately did, and in rebuilding housing, it's almost one would wonder if he got some of that inspiration from what he saw on Charlotte Street.
Yeah, that's quite possible.
Habitat Humanity, that he saw this and he said, you know what, this is, so not only did it affect the Bronx or the image of the Bronx, but ultimately might have affected him as well.
Right.
Let's just go back to JFK in order to wrap this up.
I think part of
you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason JFK is so remembered today is his use of words, his language. He has more quotations in Bartlett's familiar quotations than any other recent president. You know, we all remember, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And programs like the Peace Corps, Kennedy was able to inspire young people who had been turned off by politics, who thought politics was a business for their grandparents. And I think that was part of Obama's success in 2008. Really, for the first time in a long time, he got young people excited again about politics. And I think one of the tragedies of these first few years is that excitement among young people has very quickly dissipated as Obama got bogged down with all the details of trying to legislate. And that sense of idealism, I think, is pretty much gone from the Obama administration, and perhaps even more significantly, it's gone from the young people today.
And maybe it's a clue as well to what you were talking about earlier as to why history or historians might judge President Kennedy a little more harshly than maybe the rest of us do, because he was so charismatic.
Yes.
And left us with so much. You know, we didn't mention Professor Alton's most recent work. It's the 9th book about the Bronx.
Ninth book, yes.
Tell us about, there it is, the Northern Borough, A History of the Bronx.
Yeah, this is the very first single-volume general history of the Bronx for the general reader that has been published since 1912. It not only brings the story up to date, but also re-examines the past and takes a look, with modern information that is available. And so now you have the narrative of the history of the Bronx from the very beginning, from 10,000 BC to today.
And many of it, let's put up information about the Bronx County Historical Society and people who want to ask more questions about the history of our wonderful borough. For you who have written so much and documented so much about the borough of the Bronx, what you're saying is this puts it all under one roof, so to speak.
It puts it all under one roof, and hopefully an easy-to-read way in which to do it.
Great.
It even tells us who Major Deegan was.
Real quick, we got about 15 seconds.
Okay, William Francis Deegan was an architectural engineer who spent World War I building barracks for the troops in upstate New York.
Okay.
After the war, he became the New York State head of the American Legion, and that is why he was famous.
He spent too much time stuck in traffic. We know
right,
that's
right.
The case. Professor Tannenbaum, thank you so much.
My pleasure,
Of
Gary.
course, people can reach you through Lehman College, and it's just a pleasure to have you with us. Maybe at the 50th anniversary, we'll come up with something new in history. Professor Alton, always a pleasure to have you. And if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of the program are available at bronxnet.org. Simply click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar. Now, next week, a very interesting and important show, as we'll give teachers a chance to stand up and be counted. In the face of a selection of a new chancellor and ongoing criticism of teachers, we thought we'd open up a dialogue to give teachers a chance to have their say. The show will also include the exclusive TV debut of a fascinating new teacher video Speak Out project, where teachers are posting video commentary about education. So teachers, next Monday night at 9 on Bronx Talk. And also, this just in, we're going to do a show on public access in the Bronx in the 21st century. And that'll be on December 6th. So Bronx Talk, one of the longest running TV shows here in New York City. And we thank everyone for joining us tonight. We thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next week.